Well, let us turn in our Bibles to Paul's first letter to the Corinthians in chapter 7. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians in chapter 7. As we have worked our way through this seventh chapter, we've heard Paul say some things about the background to his instructions, which he doesn't usually say in his letters. So, for example, in verse 10, he writes, "To the married I give this command, not I, but the Lord." Verse 12, he writes, "To the rest I say this, I, not the Lord." And now in verse 25, he says, "I have no command from the Lord, but I give a judgment." Now, as I said on a previous occasion, such statements should not cause us to think that this chapter is not divinely inspired or is any less authoritative than any other part of the Bible. This seventh chapter is covered by the apostolic authority which Paul claims at the very beginning of the letter, and therefore it should be read as coming from the pen of a man divinely commissioned and divinely inspired to communicate God's truth to God's church. But what those statements in verses 12 and 25 do indicate is that Paul is addressing situations which our Lord Jesus never addressed directly during his time on this earth, and therefore he's not able to draw on previous teaching given by Jesus. That is what he means in verse 25 when he says, "I have no command from the Lord, but I give a judgment." But that does not mean that what he says is any less divinely inspired than what he says elsewhere. And that is why he's keen to emphasize in verse 25 that he and what he says is trustworthy, and then in verse 40 that he does have the Spirit of God. He's not just thinking random thoughts and putting pen to paper. He is writing under the inspiration of the Spirit. And as he writes under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit of God, he says a number of things in this closing section of chapter 7 to those who may be thinking of getting married. If you compare the NIV and the ESV translations of verse 25, you will see that there is some debate as to whether he is addressing single people generally or whether he is addressing single people who are already betrothed or engaged, as we would say. But either way, whichever of those translations is correct, either way, he is addressing people who are seriously thinking about getting married. And he wants them to do so with their eyes wide open, so to speak. He wants them to take into account certain important factors as they consider getting married. And in order to achieve that, he highlights a number of things about marriage. The first of those being in verses 25 to 31. And there he's emphasizing that marriage is temporary in the light of eternity. Marriage is temporary in the light of eternity. As the opening verse of the chapter indicates, Paul is responding to certain issues which the Corinthian Christians have raised in a letter that they have sent to him. And so that being the case, we should not take 1 Corinthians 7 as being representative of everything that Paul believed or taught on the subject of marriage. Instead, we need to remember that it's what he believed and taught in response to certain questions. We also need to remember that Paul is writing to people who found themselves in a particular historical and social context. As is well known, Corinth was a place that was renowned for its immorality. And it was precisely because of the prevalence of immorality that Paul said some of the things that he said in verses 2 to 6. But that does not mean that those verses represent everything that Paul believed or taught on the subject of marriage. Instead, it was what he emphasized in the light of the surrounding social context that the recipients of the letter found themselves in. And we need to remember that as we come to this final section of the chapter. And I say that because on our first reading of these 15 or so verses, you may have got the impression that Paul wasn't really over the moon about marriage. Was that your impression as we read it? And instead saw it as being at best something that was second best. But again, we need to remember that he is addressing people who found themselves in a particular historical and social context, and that is emphasized in verse 26, where we hear him introducing this final section with these words: because of the present crisis. Did you notice that? Because of the present crisis, or as it is in other translations, because of the present distress. Now, precisely what that present crisis was, we do not know. Some have suggested that it may have been a famine throughout the region. Others have suggested that it was a period of persecution that was looming on the horizon. Some have thought that he's referring to a particular crisis that was taking place within the church at that time, which might explain why we read in chapter 11, verse 30, of several within the congregation taken ill and some even dying under the discipline of God. But whatever the crisis was, it perhaps helped to explain why Paul doesn't come across as being quite as enthusiastic about marriage in these verses as the Bible on the whole would view the subject of marriage. It would be similar, I suppose, to the situation that our grandparents and great-grandparents, depending on what age you are, found themselves in as the Second World War was breaking out. People planning on getting married back then would have to seriously consider whether marriage, was it really the number one priority? Was it the best thing to do in the light of the present crisis? I suppose the only comparable crisis we've known in recent years was the pandemic. As COVID got nearer and lockdowns were announced, those who had planned on getting married, you may remember it's only 4 years ago, those who had planned on getting married had to seriously consider whether to go ahead or not. Was it the priority at that moment in time? Was it the best thing to do in the light of the present crisis? The advice of parents and friends and church leaders under such circumstances might be quite different from what they would have said under normal circumstances. And likewise, the advice of Paul during this present crisis, whatever it was, might be a little bit different from what he would have said under normal circumstances. And that is why, in the light of the present crisis, he says, verse 26, I think that it is good for you to remain as you are. Are you married? Do not seek a divorce. Are you unmarried? Do not look for a wife. But as often happens throughout these verses, Paul wants to make it clear that the decision to get married or not get married under such circumstances, it's not a matter of right or wrong. It's not a matter of obedience or disobedience. And that is why he immediately goes on to say in verse 28, but if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she hath not sinned. But those who marry will face many troubles in this life. And I want to spare you this. Can you imagine standing down there on your wedding day, a day that you've looked forward to for months and perhaps even years, and you hear the minister who's conducting the wedding say, he says, and my text for today is 1 Corinthians 7 verse 28, and the second half of the verse which reads, but those who marry will face many troubles in this life, and I want to spare you this. Can you picture it? It's not the most popular of wedding texts, I can assure you of that. And let's hope that if any minister does decide to use it, let's hope that he makes sure that the sermon happens before the vows, so that the young couple at least have a chance to change their minds. Do you see now why it's important to read these verses in the light of that present crisis that Paul mentioned back in verse 26? Please don't think that 1 Corinthians 7 verse 28 is all that Paul or all that the Bible has to say on the subject of marriage. Read Genesis 1 and 2. Read the book of Ruth. Read the Song of Solomon. Read the prophecy of Hosea. Read John chapter 2. Read Paul's own words in Ephesians chapter 5. Read Revelation chapter 19. And you may have noticed that in those references I gave on the subject of marriage, they virtually go from the start of the Bible, Genesis 1, right through to Revelation 19, which is almost at the very end of the Bible. And that gives you an idea as to just how big a theme marriage is in the Bible. It's a dominant theme all the way from Genesis through to Revelation, from the start of the Bible and to the end of the Bible. And if you're not a Christian this morning, then can I just say that that is the great storyline of the Bible. Yes, we've read in Genesis chapter 1 about God creating a man and a woman and bringing them together in marriage. But that is a picture of an even greater marriage that develops throughout the storyline of the Bible, where God enters into marriage with sinful, undeserving people like you and me. And in order to do so, he sends into this world a husband. The greatest husband you'll ever find, the Lord Jesus Christ. And the great storyline of the Bible, which reaches that climax in Revelation 19 with the marriage supper of the Lamb. The great storyline of the Bible is that Christ loves his church and gives himself up for her, and she becomes his bride. That is what the Bible is all about. That great marriage. And our little marriages, if I can call them that, they're a little picture, a little illustration of that great marriage. But you read those passages all the way from Genesis 1 through to Revelation 19, and you'll see just how great and glorious a theme this is throughout the Bible. And then you read this passage in the light of those passages, and you'll see that Paul's teaching here is shaped to some extent by the circumstances or crises that the Corinthians faced. That is why he goes on to say in verse 29, "What I mean, brothers, is that the time is short. From now on, those who have wives should live as if they had none, those who mourn as if they did not, those who are happy as if they were not, those who buy something as if it were not theirs to keep, those who use the things of this world as if not engrossed in them." Now, in view of what Paul has said already earlier in the chapter and what he says elsewhere, he cannot intend these verses to be taken literally. For example, to say that those who have wives should live as if they had none, that contradicts what he said in verses 2 to 6. If he's speaking literally, that is. Instead, he's using hyperbolic language to emphasize that we should not live as if the present is all that there is, or as if the present was all that matters. The time is short for these people, verse 29. The time is short. A crisis of enormous proportion is looming on the horizon, and therefore they ought to live in the present in the light of what is soon to come, and especially so, as end of verse 31, this world in its present form is passing away. And therein lies the application for us many years later. Although we may not be facing an imminent crisis, as far as we know, I would have said that exactly 4 years ago today, and little did we know But although we may not be facing an imminent crisis, you and I as Christian people are still supposed to live in the light of what is yet to come. Like those people in Paul's day, we are not supposed to live as if the present is all that there is or is all that matters. We are not supposed to live as if this life is all that there is. As the famous gospel hymn of an older generation used to sing, "This world is not my home. I'm just a passing through." Beyond this life, there is an eternity, and we're supposed to live in the light of that coming eternity. And the obvious implication of that for the subject of marriage is that the marriage relationship is temporary and relatively short-lived when compared with eternity. On one occasion, Jesus was told about a woman who had been married 7 times due to each of the husbands dying, and the question which was put to him was this: at the resurrection, i.e. at the return of Jesus Christ, whose wife will she be of the 7, since all of them were married to her? And in reply, Jesus said, Matthew 22, verse 30, he says, at the resurrection, people will neither marry nor be given in marriage. And so although the Bible clearly teaches lifelong marriage relationships, although the Bible clearly teaches that, the Bible also makes clear that the marriage relationship is a temporary relationship in that it is for this life only. It is, as we say in the marriage vows, until death us do part. And therefore, like all the other decisions we make in life, the decision to get married or not to get married should be made in the light of eternity, and should be made bearing in mind that in the light of eternity, the marriage relationship is a temporary and a transient relationship. Secondly, verses 32 to 35, and the second thing Paul wants to remind them and us about marriage is that not only marriage is temporary in the light of eternity, but that marriage can be complicated in reality. Now, having said in verse 28 that he wants to spare the singles within the Corinthian church the trouble of marriage, he now tells in verse 32 that he would like them to be free from the concerns of marriage. He then goes on in the remainder of verses 32 to 35 to explain what he means by that. Verse 32, an unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affair, how he can please the Lord, but a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife, and his interests are divided. Likewise, verse 34, an unmarried woman or virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit. But a married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world, how she can please her husband. Now, please note, by contrasting singleness and marriage in this way, Paul is not making a contrast between right and wrong, or between good and bad. That is not the type of contrast he's making. And we know that because by the time we get to verse 35, he says, I am saying this for your own good, not to restrict you. If Paul thought that one of those two options was wrong, if Paul thought that one of those two options was bad, then he would have sought to restrict us by saying something to the effect, look, whatever you do, don't go down the road of getting married. That is not what he's saying in these verses. Instead, he says what he says in these verses so that those who are thinking about getting married may be aware of the changes and the complications which marriage brings. Some of you who are still unmarried, did you realize that? it does bring a few complications at times. For example, prior to getting married, your choices and decisions in life. Decisions such as where you will live, what you will do for a job, how you will spend your time, how you will spend your money, and so on. Those decisions are made on the basis of what you as an individual thinks is best. Best in the service of God and best for the glory of God. Whereas when you get married, you still have to figure out what is best. Best in the service of God and best for the glory of God. But this time you're doing so not merely as an individual, but as a couple. And believe me, that does make the choices and decisions of life a little bit more complicated. For example, you finish university as a single person and you start looking for a job. Yes, you ought to pray about it, and yes, you ought to consider which job and which place will provide opportunities for you to live for God and to serve God to the best of your abilities. But at the end of the day, it is you as an individual who's looking for a job. Whereas if you finish university as a married couple or as a couple of single people intending to get married, then the process of finding a job becomes a lot more complicated. And that both of you now have to find a job in the same locality. As a single person, you can give as much of your free time to personal evangelism, CU activities, the work of the church, summer camps, overseas mission trips. You can give as much of your time to those things as you wish. Whereas get married, and you have other people and other factors to take into account. As Paul says in verse 34, your interests will be divided. You have a wife or a husband to think about. You have a wife or a husband to care for and to spend time with, and eventually children to care for. And that will for sure affect the freedom which you have to spend on those other aspects of Christian service that I've just mentioned. And I emphasize other aspects of Christian service, because we must not fall into the trap here of a sacred secular divide in life, which thinks that unless we are actively engaged in evangelism or some other aspect of the Lord's work, as we say, that we are not doing anything that is of spiritual or eternal value in the sight of God. We mustn't fall into that trap. That is wrong. Maintaining a God-honouring marriage and bringing up a family in a God-honouring way is of equal significance in the sight of God and is in itself a much-needed form of service to God, and especially so in a society like ours. It is just a different type of Christian service. And that is the point that Paul is making in these verses. In view of the Bible's teaching on marriage as a whole, he cannot possibly be saying that marriage is second best. As he said back in verse 7, each man has his own gift from God. One has this gift, another has that gift. And what he is saying in these verses is that those who are single for whatever reason, those who are single should not consider their Christian lives or their Christian service to be inferior or second best in any way. They shouldn't. Because just as a married couple can serve God in a way that they perhaps can't, so they as single people can serve God in a way and with a freedom that the married couple can't. And Paul's concern in these verses is that in view of the present crisis, verse 26, and in view of the fact that the time is short, verse 29, his concern is that single people appreciate the unique opportunities that are theirs while they are still single. Rather than wishing their life away thinking, if only I was married, if only And rather than rushing into marriage on the assumption that it is only a way to effectively live for God or effectively serve God, Paul wants them to see and to use their present state of singleness for what it really is in the sight of God, and not as our society and sometimes the church has portrayed it. As Paul says in verse 35, I am saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, but that you may live in a right way, in undivided devotion to the Lord. They can do so for the simple reason that get married, and life will of necessity become a little bit more complicated. Thirdly and finally, verses 36 to 41. And there we see that marriage and singleness are both good, so be free. Now, as you can see from the footnote in the NIV, if you're using an NIV, there is some debate as to who Paul is actually addressing from verse 36 onwards. Is it a man who's engaged to a woman? Or is it a father who's in two minds as to whether he should give his daughter in marriage? Bear in mind that fathers would have had far more say on the subject within that culture back then. On balance, I think it's perhaps better to take it as a young man who's engaged, but there is a question about that on Tuesday evening, so if you're not sure about that, then do feel free to come along and discuss that. But either way, it is addressed to people who are seriously considering marriage. Either their marriage or the marriage of their daughter. And here is what Paul says to them. If anyone thinks he is acting improperly towards the virgin he is engaged to, and if she's getting on in years and he feels he ought to marry, he should do as he wants. He's not sinning. They should get married. But the man who has settled the matter in his own mind, who's under no compulsion, but has control over his own will, and who has made up his mind not to marry the virgin, this man also does the right thing. So then he who marries the virgin does right, but he who does not marry her does even better. And likewise, when he comes to address the widows in verses 39 and 40, he says a similar thing. She is free to marry again, but in my judgment, verse 40, she is happier if she stays as she is. And as we've seen already this morning, the reason why Paul considers the latter option of remaining unmarried to be the better option is perhaps because of the particular crisis they were facing at that time in Corinth, verse 26, or because he personally has experienced the advantages of being single in his evangelistic and missionary endeavours, as described in verses 32 to 34. But either way, his personal experience and his expression of what is better is not to be considered binding on other Christians. The whole point of these verses is that the Christian is free. The Christian is free to decide for themselves, depending on their personal desires and personal circumstances. They are free to decide for themselves whether to marry or whether to remain single. Contrary to what some within Corinth were saying, neither marriage nor singleness makes you more spiritual. Contrary to what some within Corinth were saying, the whole subject of marriage and singleness is one of those areas in life where the Christian enjoys freedom and liberty, and consequently we must not feel pressurized into getting married, or we must not feel constrained to remain single. Marriage and singleness are both good. And so if the opportunity to get married arises, says Paul, then as a Christian you're free to choose the one or the other. But although Paul emphasizes the tremendous freedom that the Christian enjoys in this life, did you notice that there are two limits to that freedom expressed in this passage? The one limit is implied, and the other limit is explicitly stated. The first limit is that of sexual relationships being limited to the marriage relationship. Did you notice that Paul assumes in verse 36, he assumes that the woman who is engaged but not yet married will still be a virgin. Did you notice that? And the reason Paul makes that assumption is not because it was the done thing in his old, antiquated, outdated Victorian society. Because don't forget, Corinthian society was anything but that. Instead, the reason he makes that assumption is because the constant and consistent teaching of the Bible is that sexual relationships between a man and a woman are only to occur after they have committed themselves to one another in a lifelong marriage covenant relationship. And that is why the advice to the man in verse 36 is that if he's not behaving properly towards his fiancée, if his passions are running strong, ESV, and he wishes to marry, then he ought to go ahead and marry the woman that he's engaged to. The other limit to the enormous freedom that we enjoy in this area of life is explicitly stated in verse 39, where Paul says that a woman, speaking about someone who's been widowed, a woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives. But if her husband dies, she is free to marry anyone she wishes. What tremendous freedom. But, and here is the limitation to that freedom, if she does remarry, then the person she marries must belong to the Lord. And what Paul says here to Christian widows could equally be applied to a Christian widower or a Christian man or woman who has never married, and that is, a Christian should only consider marrying another Christian. For a Christian to enter into such a binding and intimate and committed relationship with a non-Christian would be, to use Paul's illustration in 2 Corinthians 6, it would be like two oxen who are unequally yoked. Can you picture two oxen that were used to pull the plough or the cart or wherever, and they would be harnessed together with a wooden yoke across their shoulders? But for that to work effectively, the two oxen had to be of similar stature. It wouldn't work if the yoke was like this. Being unequally yoked, they would not be walking in step or in sync or in harmony with one another. The one would be pulling in one direction and the other pulling in another direction. I'm speaking now about a Christian marrying a non-Christian. The one would be pulling in one direction and the other pulling in another direction, all through life with different values, different priorities, different ambitions, and ultimately a different destiny. Rather than be unequally yoked in that way, says Paul at the close of 1 Corinthians 7, if you are a Christian, then make sure you marry a Christian. That is the choice of marriage partner we are to make if we choose to get married. But on that subject, don't forget that marriage and singleness are both good. And so we are free to choose the one or the other. Three things that this final section teaches on the subject of marriage. Firstly, marriage is temporary in the light of eternity. Secondly, marriage can be complicated in reality. And thirdly, marriage and singleness are both good. So we ought to remember that we have three